Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about what finally came out of the COP26 climate meet in Glasgow and why a lot of people are disappointed by it. We also take a quick look at an RSS ideologue talking about banning social media. But first, we talk about the Central Bureau of Investigation and the Enforcement Directorate. Last week on Sunday, 2 ordinances were signed by the President of India, Ram Nath Kovind. These ordinances effectively extend the tenures of the directors of both CBI and ED, though these extensions will depend on the government. In this segment, Deeptiman Tiwary, who reports on government agencies for the Indian Express, joins us to talk about this change and why it raises concerns. So, Deeptiman, could you first talk about how long the tenures of the directors of CBI and ED have been so far?
Under the law, the tenures of both CBI and ED directors is fixed at 2 years. It cannot be less than 2 years. That is what the law says, both under the CVC Act, which governs the appointment and tenure of Director of ED, and the DSPE Act, which is the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act, which governs the appointment and tenure of CBI Director. Both say it cannot be less than 2 years. So that's the legal position which has been arrived at after in the Vineet Narayan judgment and after several deliberations as far as ED Director's tenure is concerned in the Supreme Court. So it has been fixed at not less than 2 years. This has been done so that there is little influence in the functioning of directors of these 2 key agencies, premier investigating agencies in the country.
The idea being that if the director of CBI or ED is involved in a case that is important or controversial, then he or she is not transferred within a short period of time.
Exactly. The idea is that whether the government likes the director or doesn't like the director for whatever reasons, he should at least have the freedom to function for a full 2 years so that he can discharge his duties without political pressure and with a modicum of independence. That is basically the intent and spirit of the law.
Yeah, and now we find that through these 2 ordinances, essentially the directors of CBI and Enforcement Directorate may hold their positions for up to 5 years. Could you talk about how that has been made possible?
Well, the government has brought in 2 ordinances which the president has promulgated, where under the CVC Act and these certain amendments have been made, which grant both CBI and ED directors a possible tenure of 5 years if the government so desires. When I say the government so desires is because none of these guys have been given fixed 5-year tenures through these ordinances. What the government has done is that over and above these 2-year tenures, it has reserved the right to give CBI and ED directors extended tenures of 1 year each for next 3 years if it feels that it is in public interest. So basically, it gives the government a lot of leeway to decide which director gets extended tenure beyond the fixed 2-year tenure and which director does not. The ordinances say that these 3 extensions will be given year-wise, like 1. So it basically becomes 2 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1.
So year after year, the government can choose to extend the tenures.
Yeah, year after year, the government can keep extending the tenures of these 2 directors. So these are the changes which have been brought. And if we go to the root of this, actually, this had been a recommendation of the CBI to the UPA government when it was in power in 2011. When the Lokpal and Lokayuktas Act was being passed by Parliament, there were select committees which were studying these legislations, and then CBI Director AP Singh, who had appeared before the select committee, had suggested that the tenure of the CBI Director should be fixed at 5 years, because 2 years is too little a time for any CBI Director to actually put the agency on a certain path, be it policy-wise or investigations-wise. The agency has complicated cases which can go on for years. If the director gets 5 assured years of service, then he can not only give a certain direction to the agency, but also pursue sensitive and important cases to the logical conclusion. His argument was that when a new director comes to the agency, it takes about 1 year for him to first understand the agency itself. And by the time he gets to work and puts things in motion, it's time to retire. So he was of the opinion that there should be 5 years of term. And he also gave examples that FBI chief gets 10 years tenure. So because CBI is also India's premier federal agency investigating sensitive matters, so it should be given that sort of a tenure.
So in this case, what was being proposed was a fixed 5-year tenure. But that, I guess, is very different from what has happened now, which is the 2+1+1 scenario where it's upon the government to extend the tenure. How have experts and former CBI directors reacted to this?
Frankly, if you look at it, these two ordinances have listened to the CBI of giving 5-year tenure to CBI director and the ED director, but actually violated the intent and spirit of that suggestion. The whole intent and spirit of that suggestion is that when there is a fixed 5-year tenure for the director, he will have greater independence. He will be free of the thought that what will happen if the government doesn't like me or dislike me or whatever. He'll get 5-year full tenure, have absolute complete independence to pursue his cases the way he deems fit, and that he would be removed only in extraneous circumstances where the PM-led committee would have to sit and the Chief Justice of India and leader of opposition would have to agree that the CBI director's continuance in office is untenable in public interest. So that sort of an independence was imagined when this fixed 5-year tenure was suggested. The previous government, that is the UPA government, had not accepted this suggestion by the CBI and had left it at 2-year tenure. Now the incumbent government is arguing that we have brought these ordinances because this was the demand of the CBI that 5 years term should be there. But again, when you give extensions rather than a fixed 5-year tenure, it does not actually grant any kind of independence to the director, because after 2 years of tenure, the director is going to keep thinking, okay, whether the government will give me an extension. So how will the government give me an extension? So the director will be busy pleasing the government to get an extension. So you basically dangle a carrot in front of the director so that he completely becomes subservient to you and keeps doing your bidding. So why, at a fundamental level, it is a good thing that the CBI and ED directors are being given 5 years of term. But at the same time, the manner in which this has been done has ample scope for manipulation.
And I suppose this, in a way, is similar to not having a fixed tenure, in a sense that you still have the government in your mind. Like, when you don't have a fixed tenure, you're thinking, what if I do something that the government does not like, and then I'll be transferred? And in this case as well, you have the government in mind, but now you're thinking, what can I do so that the government extends my tenure?
Absolutely. So you basically dangle a carrot in front of the bureaucrat so that he keeps trying to please you so that you give him an extended tenure. However, it would be wrong to entirely blame the government for this. What are the bureaucrats doing after 35, 38 years of service? If for 3 years of extended tenure you're ready to sell your soul, then why should the government be blamed?
And next we talk about COP26. Last week, COP26, the climate change meet that was taking place in Glasgow, came to an end. And from it emerged the Glasgow Climate Pact, a set of decisions related to climate change that over 190 countries participating in it agreed upon. There were a lot of expectations from this meet, but the pact and its decisions have come as a disappointment to many people. Indian Express's Amitabh Sinha, who writes on science and climate change and who attended the COP26, joins us to talk about the Glasgow Climate Pact. Amitabh, people were expecting a lot from this climate meet. Could you talk about what eventually came out of it?
So, as you would know, all these COPs, or the climate change conferences, which are organized around this time of the year, annual event. So the final outcome is a set of decisions. There are several decisions that are taken, and those decisions are put in what is known as a decision text, which when all the countries agree to it, in generic terms, it's called an agreement. Every previous COP has also yielded an agreement. An agreement I'm using in a very general sense, but it's basically a set of decisions that all the country agree to, and they are also given different names. So the set of decisions that have come out of Glasgow are called Glasgow Climate Pact. And you have similar names given to other decisions also, which have been taken in the past. So broadly, this is what comes out of a climate meet. Now, what are those decisions? That actually defines how important, how good, or how bad, or how lackluster climate conference was.
And this time, and you've written about it as well, a lot of people, especially activists, are not particularly happy or satisfied with the Glasgow Climate Pact, right?
Yes. So, frankly, no, activists are never happy. So, if you look from their angle, we are certainly not doing enough. So, that is one part of it. But it's also a fact that a lot of expectations was generated from this climate summit. In normal course, what all that this COP was supposed to do was to at least finalize the what is known as the rule book for the Paris Agreement. Rule book is like subordinate laws that we have in different countries. Even in India, we have what are known as subordinate laws. So there is a law that is passed by parliament, and then there are implementing rules, rules and guidelines that implement that law, that are generally framed by the government. So similarly, here, Paris Agreement is the law, and that needs to be implemented. So the rules and guidelines that will help in implementation of the Paris Agreement are generically known as the Paris Agreement Rule Book, or the rules and procedures of Paris Agreement. So there were some elements of those rules and procedures which were still to be decided, and that was the main agenda before COP26 officially. But in the run up to the conference, a lot of it was added, a lot of expectations was generated about this conference, mainly around raising of ambition. And when we say raising of ambition, is basically to increase the climate actions that are being taken place across the world. So that was the expectations. And that was, when you weigh it according to that expectation, then of course, not just activists, but also everyone would be underwhelmed by what came out of COP26.
Okay, so now let's talk about the agreement that finally came out, the Glasgow Climate Pact. What are the main highlights of it?
So now, if we look at the climate action plans that are being taken in any country, in various countries across the world, basically they are classified into two or three different kinds. One, of course, is the mitigation part, the mitigation of emissions. What that means is you reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. So basically, the greenhouse gases are a problem. Emissions of greenhouse gases is what is causing the global warming. So if you reduce the emissions, that's the best way to fight climate change. So that's pretty straightforward. So on the mitigation part, the idea was to increase mitigation efforts so that you cut more and more greenhouse gas emissions. The higher your ambition is, the better it is for the planet. So if we look at what happened on mitigation front at COP26, so some of the countries, if you remember in the first part of the conference, they had made some unilateral announcements. The leaders of those countries had made certain announcements, including India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, had made some announcements about enhancing their own climate action plans. And at least some part of it relates to mitigation. India already has a climate action plan, which has three different components. And on two of those components, Modi said, we will enhance our targets. Modi also announced three fresh targets, two for 2030 period and one for 2070 period. So these targets together would mean that India's climate action plan and also its mitigation component has been enhanced. And there were some other countries also which made certain announcements to enhance their climate action plans. But these are not part of COP decisions. Remember, I said each COP delivers a set of decisions at the end, which every country has to agree to. Now, the announcements that were made during the first part of the conference, these are unilateral announcements of the countries. But the fact that they were delivered at Glasgow at COP26, probably Glasgow can legitimately claim credit for having those kind of announcements as well. So on the mitigation part, there was some movement, some raising of ambition, at least from some countries.
Okay, so these things you mentioned on the mitigation front were technically not part of the COP26 decisions. So what were the decisions that were part of it?
So from this set of decisions, what has come out is each of the country has been asked to strengthen their existing climate action plans by next year. The countries currently have targets for 2030, and they have been asked to strengthen all those 2030 targets. So that is one decision in the set of decisions that have come out from COP26. Similarly, on mitigation front, there are a few others also, like a decision has been taken to do an annual assessment of where we are headed and are we doing enough sort of thing. Then another decision has been to request the UN Secretary General, for example, to convene a meeting of all the world leaders to discuss how climate action plans of each country can be enhanced.
Okay, so far we have been talking about decisions on mitigation, essentially those related to reducing emissions. Now, the other category of decisions are related to adaptation, which basically relates to the measures that countries need to take to adapt to climate change. The idea being that climate change and global warming are already impacting countries through things like extreme weather events, floods, droughts, heat waves. So we need to find a way to adapt to those changes and deal with them in a better way. So what was the main decision we saw on this front?
So one, of course, is the COP26 has asked all the developed countries to at least double the scale of adaptation finance. Finance is means of implementation, right? Without money, you can't do anything. And adaptation efforts require a lot of money. And right now, the money is terribly insufficient. And in 2019, roughly about $15 billion flowed into adaptation efforts. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that under this climate architecture, developed countries are mandated, they are under an obligation to provide money to developing countries to help them deal with climate change. And out of that money, a certain portion goes for adaptation as well. Money is required for everything. Money is required for adaptation as well. So what Glasgow 26, COP26 has said in the set of decisions that have come out, Glasgow has said that the developed countries should at least double their money that is going for adaptation purposes. So that money, whatever it was in 2019, should be doubled at least by 2025. So in the next 4 years, whatever was there in 2019, and as says that figure is somewhere around 15 billion. So by 2025, it should be at least 60 or 70 billion dollars. So that is one decision that has been taken. Also, there was another adaptation related decision that was taken, was to create a work program basically to define what is a global goal of adaptation. Now, I'll take just 30 seconds to explain that because that might not be familiar to everyone. Basically, a lot of countries had been asking that we should have a global goal on adaptation, that what are we trying to achieve? There is a global goal on mitigation, by the way. That global goal is that the world as a whole should be able to cut their emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, in such a manner that the temperature rise is kept below 2 degrees centigrade from pre-industrial times. So that is a global goal. And, you can mark the progress against that global goal. There is no global goal on adaptation part. Primarily because global goal on adaptation is a difficult thing to define. But a lot of countries, smaller countries, countries in Africa, countries with relatively poor resources, countries which are, island states, for them, adaptation forms the core of climate action. Because these are not big emitters. They are not the ones who can cut their emissions a lot because they are not emitting too much in any case. And these are also the countries which are the most vulnerable to climate change. So adaptation is something which is very dear to them.
And I suppose adaptation is also so much about the immediate, right? How these countries are being impacted right now as opposed to the future.
Yes, you are very right. So adaptation is something that is very immediate. And this is also the difficulty in defining a global goal, is the fact that adaptation is much more immediate and it is local. The benefits of adaptation is local. So if, say, India takes some adaptation efforts, India would stand to benefit. But if India takes certain emission cuts, India does not benefit, the entire planet benefits from it. So these countries which are at the forefront, which are the front lines of climate disasters, they are very keen that adaptation should get the same amount of focus that mitigation exercises get. So for them, it is very, very crucial. So the idea of this global goal helps the world to measure its progress along on the adaptation front. So what could be a good adaptation goal, good global goal on adaptation?
Okay, so we have decisions on mitigation, adaptation, and the last category is that of finance. What has stood out about that?
So this is an area where there has been a maximum disappointment, and not surprisingly, money is in short supply. And this is not new. Money is in short supply right from the start. There is very little money available that would make the kind of transitions that are being talked about possible, right?
Yeah, like the developed countries had even promised to mobilize at least $100 billion every year starting from 2020. But we know that that hasn't happened.
Yes, exactly. So on the money front, there was an expectation that some developed countries would be able to promise something. But even before the conference had started, there was a huge disappointment because you mentioned the $100 billion figure. Way back in 2009, the developed countries had promised that they would mobilize $100 billion every year from 2020. 2020, last year, there was no conference because of COVID. So when they started to measure this year what has been the flow of climate finance, they realized that this 2020 target of $100 billion had still not been met, right? And then the developed countries said that yes, it hasn't been met, but now we would be able to meet that target only in 2023. So instead of 2020, we would begin the $100 billion delivery, or at least we'll touch that figure only in 2023. So that 2020 deadline was extended by 3 years. So that was a huge disappointment even before the start of the Glasgow summit. And there wasn't any silver lining there. On the finance front, nothing which came out which was very encouraging from Glasgow.
Yeah, and this part is also disappointing because the other decisions on mitigation and adaptation can't happen without money. So, when you take a step back and look at this entire Glasgow Climate Pact, what is your takeaway from it? Because for many, it sounds like, some more promises, some more plans, and not that much money devoted to it.
So it actually depends on how you want to look at it. It's a glass half full or a glass half empty sort of a situation. These conferences are pretty useful. They are useful because they do galvanize global action on climate change. In the absence of these conferences, probably you would not even get what you are getting right now in terms of climate actions. But are they able to deliver what is required according to science? That's a doubtful question. Also, it's very unlikely because the kind of things that science asks you to do to deal with climate change, we are not very close to it. So, if you want to measure the success of these COPs or these conferences in terms of science, then of course they are underachieving. They are not doing enough. But are they delivering something useful? No, of course they are. This conference does galvanize some action, also puts pressure on some of the other countries which are not doing enough, at least to do something. Now, of course, it is not completely adequate, but far better than having no plan at all.
And in the end, we talk about S Gurumurthy. Gurumurthy, who is an RSS ideologue and the editor of the Tughlaq magazine, yesterday called social media anarchic and advocated the need to explore the option of banning it. Gurumurthy had been speaking at an event to mark the National Press Day. According to a report by Indian Express's Saurav Roy Burman, Gurumurthy was delivering the keynote speech at an event organized by the Press Council of India, where he said that social media was an impediment on the path of an orderly society. His suggestions were opposed by some senior members of the council who were present at the event held at the Constitution Club of India. Gurumurthy said that China has destroyed social media and that even the Indian Supreme Court has expressed concern over its role. He also pointed out the role of social media in fomenting unrest in countries like Myanmar and Sri Lanka. Later, responding to a question, he said that while a ban may sound tough, He believes that anarchy should be banned and urged the council to carry out a thorough documentation of the role of social media platforms. Among the council members who raised red flags on Gurumurthy's speech were Jaishankar Gupta and Gurubir Singh. Shukla questioned Gurumurthy's silence on issues such as the arrest of journalists in Tripura, the alleged use of Pegasus spyware by government agencies, and the Rafale purchase issue, among others. Gurumurthy responded saying that what eventually matters is whether the judiciary is keeping a check on the abuse of power. He also criticized the NCERT's manual on inclusion of transgender children in school, saying it will create chaos in the minds of children. You were listening to Three Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.